in their in their webinar entitled Taking Care of What Takes Care of Us, Central Coast's First Nation Approach to Marine Protections and IPCAs. As usual, I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Beck Borcher, Marine Protected Areas Coordinator for the Gwillimimabwe-Siuslaw, or KMK. Our organization was created to oversee the negotiations and consultation process between the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, the province, and the Government of Canada. So KMK is governed, and we receive our mandates directly from the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs, and collectively we work on broader nation issues for the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia. And I'm here in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Obviously, 3 seasons of webinars, we're not doing it alone. It's a collaborative effort with other Mi'kmaq organizations and supporters. And so I'll just quickly go through our partners because we couldn't do it without them. So firstly, helping to support is the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, UINR. They represent 5 of the Mi'kmaq communities on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, and they were formed to ensure the sustainable use and protection of natural resources, all while maintaining Unama'ki Mi'kmaq traditions and worldviews. Also working with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, CMM, they're a nonprofit that works to proactively promote and assist Mi'kmaq community initiatives towards self-determination and enhancement of community. Also working with Oceans North, who supports marine conservation in partnership with Indigenous and coastal communities, and of course, Dalhousie University as well. So on behalf of all of us, as people continue to filter in, just a few housekeeping tidbits. As you come in, please make sure that your cameras and your microphones are off so that our speakers can have the spotlight. Any questions or comments or ideas you want to talk about a little bit more can just be dropped in the chat. It's going to be monitored by our facilitator, and we'll get to all your questions at the end. If you submitted questions ahead of time, thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll be sure to bring those up, and our presenters are up to date on what sort of themes arose from the pre-submitted questions as well. Just a reminder, I'm almost done, that the last 30 minutes will be for our Indigenous participants only. So at 3 o'clock on the dot, we're going to take a little bit break. If that doesn't apply to you, feel free to head out, and remember that you can come back to our webinar. It's recorded, released on our YouTube page on the KMK YouTube channel, and our Mi'kmaq or Indigenous participants can stay on. And that way we can have a really nice conversation with our speakers. There's also going to be a door prize tonight, so we'll be announcing that before people head out. And I now get to turn it over to our wonderful facilitator, Dr. Heidi Vegan. So quickly, Heidi has been absolutely amazing. We're all in good hands with her tonight. She works as an assistant professor in management with Dalhousie University and focuses on leadership development, systemic discrimination, and resiliency. Heidi has extensive experience working with First Nation leaders and communities with a passion for cultivating self-governing practices and sustainable communities. And I am done. Happy to turn it over to you, Heidi. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Thanks very much, Beck. So it's an exciting day. We have our great 3 speakers today. And so I'm just going to remind everybody that if you have your mics on at any point in time, just to make sure we shut that off, we'll make a comment in the chat box if it's needed, because it does happen periodically, but we want to make sure we have a nice smooth recording. So I'm just going to take a moment to introduce our fabulous speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. Julie Carpenter is a member of the Hetsick Nation and has dedicated the past 17 years towards working with her nation to define and advance their vision for marine environment. And that's in collaboration with neighboring communities. And I'll have Julie share that. She's a marine planner for the Hetsick Integrated Research Management Department that works with the Central Coast Nations technical staff. And they advance the environmental, culture, and economic goals outlined in both the Hetsick Marine Use Plan and the Harmonized Central Coast Marine Use Plan. And they do that through intergovernmental processes such as the Marine Planning Partnership, which is called MAP, and the NSB Marine Protected Area Network. She holds a BSc in biology from the University of Victoria. So we're excited to hear from you, Julie. Our second speaker is Trinity Mack, and she's a member of the Nuxalk Nation, sits as the youth rep on the Nuxalk Marine Use Committee, and has recently entered a new role as the Fisheries Reconciliation Manager for the community, and she's working on that stewardship this year. She is currently a student at the University of British Columbia for Forest Carbon Management and at the College of the Rockies for Environmental Studies. At 21 years old, Trinity's goals are to give youth perspectives and to learn from her peers and mentors. So Trinity, we're delighted to have you here and looking forward to your contribution today. And finally, we have Taylor Mason, who grew up in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nations in Prince Edward Island, which fostered an interest in marine and coastal water resources early in her life. Taylor holds an undergraduate degree in aquatic resources and public policy and a master's in marine management from Dalhousie. And she has worked with Indigenous communities on all 3 of Canada's coastlines, each role focused on fostering and amplifying opportunities, enhancing opportunities for communities to exercise their sovereignty in decision-making. So currently, Taylor is working with the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, and she's supporting the Central Coast First Nations efforts in community-driven marine planning and protection. So as you can see, we have 3 extremely strong collaborative speakers today, and we're delighted to hear from you. So what we're going to do now is turn that over, and we're going to have you, I'll just stay on the mic just until your presentation is shared to make sure it's all set up, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. So we'll just wait for one moment. And for everybody's benefit, we'll be going about 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be some question and answer period. And as Beck and let you know, we will be moving over afterwards to a Indigenous only section. So I think it's Taylor. So we'll just flip so that we can see the presentation mode. Right now we have the beautiful slides in the background, the one where we can see things, the next slide.
Okay, yeah, let me try that again.
We did this earlier, so.
I know. It's always trying to figure out, oh, present, still the same?
Still, yeah, so that's your presenter view.
Let's try this.
And for the benefit of everybody, we are recording this part so that we can put the presentations up on the webinar series on the, I think it's the KMKNO site. But the section where we have the Indigenous only, we will be recording it, but we will not be sharing it with anybody. So it's just to help with taking some notes and things. You are perfect now, Taylor. So I'm going to turn that over to you.
Great, I'll pass it off to Trinity to start, but thanks so much, Heidi.
Hi, good afternoon or morning, everybody. Our presentation today is Taking Care of What Takes Care of Us, a Central Coast First Nations approach to marine protection and IPCAs in BC. Here is an outline of our presentation today. We're hoping we can get through this nice and easy today. Thank you. So first off, we're going to start with a really nice video that was made in the Central Coast.
All part of us, I think. It's something that we get together and do as a family.
This community still depends on aquatic resources, and in a lot of ways, it's still very much nomadic people. We still go out and harvest the herring and the seaweed and the salmon.
You know, it's just something that's been kind of engraved in our genes, so to speak, over the generations. That, you know, we've depended on things like the salmon, for example, for so long that it's just something that our bodies need and is really essential to our diet.
We know we're going to be here. We aren't going anywhere. We've been here for thousands of years. And we want to make sure that everybody can have that same history. It's very important to us that we are able to sustain the thing that's been sustaining us for so long.
We'd be in big trouble if we didn't have salmon.
There was a fisherman, but there's no fish there now because it's been mismanaged by fisheries.
The majority of the time when there's important decisions to be made, they're made from someone in a three-piece suit in Ottawa. You know, someone in Ottawa hasn't a clue what's going on over here.
It's been huge decline in all aquatic species all across the board. Everything from salmon to abalone to herring, you name it, they're gone.
And that's why the First Nations need to jump in. We need to start working together.
The Central Coast of British Columbia is home to the Great Bear Rainforest and the Indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years. The Heldsick, the Wee-Canoe, the Kitasoo-Hey-Hey, and the Newhawk have joined together to form the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, otherwise known as SECURA. Through the combined use of science and traditional knowledge, the nations are collectively dedicated to stewarding these marine resources in a manner that ensures local sustainable economies, intact ecosystems, and healthy communities. The CURA aims to leave behind a history of mismanagement and move towards a system of co-management, working in collaboration with government to manage the marine resources within their territories.
And for us, I think, we live there, we see it, we see things firsthand. So we want to make sure that, we have a say in what's going on because we see it all firsthand. So we started developing our own science programs. We're doing science around things like herring, things like sea cucumber, rockfish, salmon, bears, you name it. We're doing tons of science programs in our communities now. And we're investing a lot of time and effort in terms of this ground truthing, really what's going on out there.
First Nations have probably some of the most robust data sets that exist for certain species in the Central Coast. They're absolutely doing the research that's necessary to support management and decision making. They've built up their scientific capacity, they've built up their institutional capacity, so they can be key players in the management process and the decision making processes on the coast.
There's lots of programs that are underway here. Probably the biggest scale is the Guardian Watchman program. Where we have 8 or 10 guardians who work full-time year-round. We have fish counters that are out in all of these systems, getting a better hands-on approach to counting salmon and understanding the salmon populations. We have people on the ground that are collecting data that will assist with these management plans and help to inform our management decisions when it comes time to do so.
When we started developing our marine plans, we interviewed tons of our elders, all of our community members, all of the fishermen, all the people who spend all of the time out there, and they know exactly what's going on in the water. Where people fished, how things have changed over time, or the large gathering of ecological species. All those different things we compiled and we put it together, and we started to zone out our territories. In terms of where things are and where things should happen, where they can't happen.
We came up with what was called an ecosystem-based management framework. This is very similar to the way First Nations have managed their territories for thousands of years. Each of the nations have held well over 100 meetings within their communities to develop their own community marine plans. Hundreds of meetings at the nation level, meetings between First Nations and provincial governments. And this planning process was replicated in the North Coast, Haida Gwaii, and North Vancouver Island. So it's probably one of the most comprehensive planning approaches in British Columbia.
Co-management for us means just having the opportunity to sit on the table with the provincial government, with the federal government, being able to take traditional ecological knowledge and local knowledge to the table, and merge that with some of the best available Western science, and using that information to be able to develop some pretty solid management plans, so marine plans, and bring some sustainability to the coast.
We know our territory, we know what it needs.
The co-management arrangements that or opportunities that exist out there are huge. We've got people that are all over the water. They're the eyes and ears on the water. And I think this information is really relevant to the day-to-day management that needs to take place out on the ocean.
We've had a lot of the discussions that needed to be had with the provincial government, with stakeholders, with scientists, and all we need now is to have a conversation with the federal government and have them come to the table in a meaningful and open way.
And let's, develop some stewardship responsibilities together. And I think that's what it's about is making sure that we're taking care of these areas, and we want to make sure that we take care of it so that future generations have something.
It's an awesome video. I love it. It's so good every time I watch it. So I know we just saw a lot of the Northern Shelf bioregion in the intro video, but I wanted to continue setting us into this place and region. The Central Coast of British Columbia is an extremely rich and biodiverse environment that provides habitat for some iconic species and ecosystems of the Great Bear Sea, including a variety of marine mammals to shellfish that travel intertidal, deep sea, and estuarine habitats, offshore banks, nearshore islands, fjords, inlets. It's truly an incredible experience. The habitat and geography of the Central Coast is so diverse. There's a big interdependency between the Great Barrier Rainforest and the marine ecosystems. This fosters a strong land and sea connection. This is why our nations have prioritized both land and marine use planning, and why an Indigenous-led approach to protection in this region is so important. Our communities here are very remote, and this has led to us building a deep connection and relationship with our marine territories, such as daily diet or daily food and diet, which I know similarly to the East Coast, the ocean is imminently connected to cultural and community well-being. In regards to their marine economies, we envision the development of a more community-based, small-scale economic opportunities that will allow us to live in these places that our ancestors have lived for thousands of years, while sustaining and enhancing cultural practices, harvesting, language, cultural sites, laws, etc. To achieve this, we build on our own successes with land use planning and turned our focus to the land and sea connection and marine use planning. This allowed us to be proactive and to drive subsequent collaborative marine planning processes with various levels of government in negotiating partnerships and agreements for co-management. The planning area of our Central Coast has a diverse range of values and activities such as renewable energy, forestry, seafood processing, aquaculture, tourism, and mining. These collaborative management processes have been designed to support sustainable resource management and works to balance multiple objectives, which include the protection of the environment, cultural values, alongside with future development of marine uses and activities. The marine planning process that we will discuss further is intended to manage these uses to help improve the efficiency of approval processes within new and existing policies and procedures, as well as reduce spatial conflicts among marine users.
Thanks, Trinity. And following up from the intro video that we saw, I wanted to talk a bit more about the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, also known as SECURA, and really emphasize the organization's purpose and how it all came together. In the late 2000s, the nations decided to come together through marine use planning processes, and that was really to set aside their issues of title, of overlapping territory, in order to address some of these steep declines in marine resources and the impacts of development in the Central Coast. They recognized that working together in the region would create a stronger voice in marine protection. And to support the coordination of this work, they built SECURA as an aggregate body. And this is the organization that I work for, and it really focuses on working with and providing support to its member nations to achieve the vision of the declaration that it laid out in December 2011, which was to foster a strong working relationship with our nations and through a common voice ensure our ecosystems return to a healthy balance while respecting our cultures, advancing our people's well-being, and enhancing our economies. So what really needs to be made clear here is that this work has been happening, since time immemorial. And each specific success that we're going to talk about today is built on a foundation of over 20 years of active two-eyed seeing planning processes with the nations and collaboratively with other governments. So I'll walk you through a bit of this history of marine planning in the Central Coast, and you'll really be able to see how the relationships and governance structures built over the years led to the Central Coast nation's position, working within systems of decision-making and inherently leading to the declaration of Indigenous protected and conservation areas in the Central Coast territories. So we're going to look at quite a bit of maps and go through some of these timelines. So just bear with us over the next little few slides.
Thank you, Taylor. So like some of the zoning work on the Central Coast began in the 80s with the development of some marine ecological reserves, which you can see in yellow on the upper left side. And then in the 90s and 2000s, all four nations started actively developing their land use plans within the Central Coast. And these from this process, we developed land conservancies, which you can see in dark green. And from there, we also developed one marine conservancy, which is the Hakai Belize Conservancy area, which is this area in kind of teal, just outside of Bella Bella. And we also developed a few marine proposed conservancies, which are in light green, which is a little bit harder to see, but there it is. And lastly, in the mid 2000s, we worked with DFO to create rockfish conservation areas, which you can see in the black hatch. This process really led to Indigenous-driven management of the Great Bear Rainforest in the Central Coast. As mentioned earlier, like the overarching goal of all foreign nations is to have a greater say in how both our land and marine resources are utilized and managed. And one moment. When nations began to see the benefits that came from their land use planning processes, and with the continued decline and the impacts to marine species and habitats, we began partnering with various philanthropic foundations to fund community level and Indigenous-led marine planning under these three principles. Taking care of what takes care of us, taking a little and leaving a lot, and place-based and localized management. And those will really form the foundation of a lot of our marine planning work. All four nations in the Central Coast worked between 2006 and 2011 to develop our own nation's marine use plans. And then once those were complete, we harmonized those plans in order so that so that we can have one plan for the Central Coast region that would create a unified voice when it came to management objectives in the region. The map that you see to the right shows the result of that. And this is a map that we've used over a few different planning processes now that kind of really highlights some of our cultural conservation priorities. So the way that we develop these, the nation's plans, we really had to each nation pull together marine planning committee or board that would help to guide the process within each of the nations. Each committee had between 8 to 10 elders, hereditary chiefs, elected councillors, commercial fishers, and other representatives from nation-led agencies and the community. Each nation had their own marine use coordinator to help coordinate the work. And we were supported by both internal and contracted biologists, planners, and GIS analysts, largely within Secura and a few other subcontractors. We are actually because these plans were finalized more than 10 years ago. We're currently in the process of starting to update our nation's marine plans to kind of reflect where we are now. So like in terms of like the federal, well, the kind of provincial and federal processes that we've been working within. So a lot of our initial marine planning work between 2007 and 2011 was originally part of the Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area process, or PNCMA, and that was with the federal government. And the goal was to be more proactive in marine use planning in a way that forced government to be reactive to the objectives and zoning within these plans. Collaborative planning. Yeah, the PNCMA process was originally a trilateral agreement between DFO, the province, and First Nations, as well as stakeholders. But in the fall of 2011, due to a few different political situations, the federal government could not reach the level of commitment and collaboration and canceled IPCA. And so from there, the nations decided to continue working with the province, who has still had a vested commitment to developing a plan for the Central Coast. And so between 2011 and 2016, the Central Coast First Nations, along with 3 other subregions in Haida Gwaii, the North Coast, and North Vancouver Island, continued to work with the province to develop what's now called the Marine Planning Partnership, or MAP. And so the MAP process basically built on what we'd already developed within each individual nation and the harmonized level plan to create community level spatial zoning and yeah, like I said, basically mirrored the work that we'd already developed, but kind of refined it based on feedback from the province, from stakeholders. And the result was basically a plan that provided recommendations for decision makers and guidance for land administrators, project planners, businesses, First Nations, local governments, and other stakeholders that was directed by the communities. But the biggest challenge with losing the federal government as a partner was that there were limitations of what recommendations we can make regarding fisheries, which is a big part of our nation's plans. This process did, however, align the nations and the province's position when the federal government did come back to the table.
Okay, thanks, Julie. So in order to implement these plans, once they were collaboratively made between the First Nations and the provincial government, MAP established a very comprehensive governance structure, and this structure continues to operate today. We wanted to share with you just the diagram that outlines the decision-making process with MAP specifically, and I'm really happy to dive deeper into this a little bit now and maybe more later on. But I do want to note that before we move on, this structure will likely change as new and collaborative trilateral and local planning processes become established. So you'll see that more initiatives have been coming on the plates of nations in the Central Coast and more opportunities for new governance in the marine space. And so this, although it's functioning now and it works well, it'll likely have to adapt to those new agreements in order to not have multiple governance processes occurring in the same region. Just to walk through lightly here, and again, happy to dive through a bit more, but essentially within MAP, we have sub-regional technical teams. So with each of those 4 subregions that Julie mentioned, there's different teams that are working on locally specific priorities related to their plans, and they work together as well to come up with recommendations on different areas and objectives within that collaborative plan. This moves through different levels. So something called the MAP Implementation Technical Team, which is a coordinated technical body. We have the MAP Secretariat that does the administration piece, and that all goes to the Marine Working Group, where you have representatives from each of the subregions, as well as higher level within the province, within other aggregate organizations, and those kind of decisions get moved into the MAP Executive Committee, where they make the final approval. So I know governance is something that is really key to a lot of this work. So like I said, happy to come back to this later on or dive a bit deeper into it. So moving on, when the MAP plans were completed, the next step was looking at protection and also enhanced legislation to put some teeth into some of this planning. And this, as Julie mentioned, involved bringing the feds back in to expand areas into planning within some of those other pieces of jurisdiction. So that includes fisheries management in particular was a key important piece to this. And this was done through the development of a marine protected area network throughout the region. And these 3 parties, so the First Nations in the region, the provincial government, and the federal government, developed an action plan that was endorsed roughly a year ago. We are now working on developing monitoring frameworks for the network and governance structures as well. So again, seeing how that governance for the MPA network will fit into MAP governance, or how both of those things will involve in coordination with one another. But something to notice on this map, and it might be tough to see without comparing it to others, is that it's not so dissimilar from the maps found that Julie was showing before. So just really emphasizing that a lot of this work has been built on what the nations did originally in their community plans. And each of these collaborative plans are highly reflective of what the nations had wanted for their own territory. So that's been a really key piece to this too. So there is another video that we wanted to show specifically on the MPA network, which I will quickly show just so people can get a sense and it's not coming directly from us. Let's see. And let me know if sound or anything doesn't work, Heidi, I'll just click.
We used to fish for 5 days straight. There was so much fish. It was such an abundance. But now he's out there fishing right now and they have one fish for a 24-hour opening.
I've seen so many dead pinks in some of the rivers, butters, cod stocks, watching the fish decline before my eyes.
I've seen the near disappearance of kelp in a lot of our sites.
With their hooligans, they used to watch them swim up the river and it'd be black, but now there's none. It's all disappearing now.
And it's overfished too. That's my freezer. They're cleaning out.
How do you think we live here? You come up here just to fish it out and then go back to your house.
We're seeing and living through a time where it's really hard for our people to sustain ourselves, economically or even for food. We have the values of taking care of what is out there, planning for a sustainable future, working with our neighbors to collectively take care of the ocean because we can't be healthy without a healthy ocean.
Marine Protected Area Network is basically a refuge for different species. We've worked since 2007 to identify areas that, through our own local knowledge, have saw depletions. Nowhere on the central coast, other than rockfish, are there any areas that are refuge for any species. So it was very important for us to make sure that species actually had a place where there was going to be no pressure. I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to know that if you protect an area, stocks will rebuild. And that's been proven time and time again. There's places like out in Aristobul when the federal government was going to announce a rockfish conservation area. One of the companies was really upset. They thought that was going to be the death of their business. Fast forward almost 25 years later, they're reporting it's one of the best things that's ever happened to them. Stocks have been rebuilding. It's feeding the west coast of that island where they have their operation. And we want to replicate that model all through the territories.
Last year, some crab closures were implemented by DFO, and we've only done one crab survey so far this year, but just seeing the difference was amazing. The populations in every one of our sites was larger than what we remember from last year.
That's the huge difference now between, our way of thinking and the world's way of thinking. The way the world is now, if you hook into something good, you just keep going till the well's dry. Look at all the dead canneries on the coast. They roll in it until there's nothing to roll in anymore and then move on. It's just always important to remember that you have to leave enough behind for them to sustain themselves. Give them a fighting chance.
Every summer we try to take up the kids, show them how to fish, try and keep it alive.
We're not going anywhere and we want to make sure that we have those resources available for us for the next 7 generations.
It's not for me because I'm getting up in age. I would like to see that for my grandkids and my sons.
I have 2 kids and they need a Bella future. The opportunities are here. The opportunities have always been here. We have fresh air, we have salmon in our water, and I think we have to protect it for longevity, for sustainability. The opportunities are all around us.
If we're harvesting responsibly, if we're putting into the regrowth of our coast, we're practicing that tradition of, leaving a place better than we found it. Just imagine what we can achieve again here.
What I love the most about showing those two videos kind of in the same presentation is you'll see folks from the first video, which was made a little while ago, and then still there in the second video, which I find is really special. You know, it really shows just the amount of effort and ongoing time that the nations have been putting into this, and it's still the same people that are living in those territories, and they're still working on implementing this. So it's just really great to kind of see these folks. And I know, Julie, you were even in the first video too, and obviously still here working on this. So it's just great to see. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Go share screen. Can folks see that? Yeah, okay, great. Let me just. Okay, so the MPA network, as I mentioned, we're working currently on that governance monitoring. That's been a key piece. But in the Central Coast specifically of the Northern Shelf region, so the nations that we work with, we're really keen on even furthering protection. So going beyond all this work that's already being done. And after considering all the potential tools out there, we've really decided to move forward with a feasibility assessment for a national marine conservation area. And that's in collaboration with Parks Canada. And we chose this avenue in particular to explore because it allows a lot of those activities to continue. So that's sustainable commercial fishing, as well as community-based commercial fishing, which is great. It allows for that kind of more support, broader support from both stakeholders and levels of government. It has a really good reputation of collaborative governance, and that's increasing the nation's say and authority in how fish and other marine resources are managed. A key piece of this is that it maintains First Nation traditional access throughout the conservation area. It allows for that delegation of enforcement to First Nations when possible, which allows for less reliance on DFO. So, you know, working with Parks Canada just opens those doors for that kind of shared authority when it comes to compliance and enforcement. And it diversifies the local economy. So it can allow for research, tourism, allow for nations to work either locally or collaboratively with different stakeholders in these areas to enhance their economies as it relates, while providing more refuges to restore some of these resources that have been lost. So this is something that we're working on now, and this feasibility assessment ends in March. So if we look at approving that, and if the communities approve it, then we'll be looking at an establishment agreement over the next few months, and then into management planning over the course of the next year or so. And yeah, that isn't everything that we're working on. So a lot of this work that the nation's marine use planning, you know, over 10 years ago, what it's led to, we're also in collaborative agreements with Transport Canada, Natural Resource Canada, Coast Guard on different types of agreements. So we have the Reconciliation Framework Agreement. We're working on the Oceans Protection Plan with TC, and we're also involved in a Fisheries Resources Reconciliation Agreement with DFO. That one has, you know, it's super complicated, but super important as well in terms of sharing decision-making around fisheries management. So that's something also really big that's happening in the area, but because we're limited on time, maybe we can jump into that another time. But just another note that all of this work did come from the communities a while ago, but it's been a long time and a lot of work. So yeah, it's a lot of capacity. And then, of course, you know, we recognize that this is an IPCA webinar series. We didn't want to wrap up our presentation without talking about this really important topic. And Central Coast nations are deep into IPCA declaration, zoning, and looking at establishment currently. One of our nations, the Kitasoo recently established a marine independent IPCA in 2022. And so they're kind of the first in the region to establish one. And now all four nations are looking at how to work together to establish, you could call it kind of a network, but each of the IPCAs are really owned and designed to belong to each of those nations. I'm sure everyone here does know what an IPCA is, but it's really just a marine protected area designation by Indigenous governments that provide lean on strong conservation outcomes in particular, which really promotes and puts like a shining light on the rights and responsibilities and priorities of Indigenous peoples whose territory these areas are in. Another important note of this is that it affirms the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We know that there's a lot of work being done on different levels of government to look into this, but this is really a clear affirmation of UNDRIP within whatever region it's being established. In the Central Coast in particular, a lot of work remains around kind of enforcement of IPCA. So how will that look? Knowing all these other enforcement agencies and collaborative processes are happening, and as well as funding. So obviously, funding is a huge piece of all of this work. So looking at funding on the implementation of IPCAs. Something really unique to the Central Coast is they're now looking at designating their IPCAs in complete overlap with the NMCA boundary that I was talking about earlier. And so that by having an IPCA completely overlap with that NMCA tool, nations can really take advantage of Crown capacity, but have more authority and kind of a step ahead in directing how it's applied. So with IPCA management planning, that can directly inform kind of what that collaborative management planning looks like with Parks Canada and other federal agencies. So that's just something that Central Coast nations in particular are looking at as kind of an innovative way to really be proactive as they have been throughout all these years. So I'll pass it off to Trinity.
Thank you, Taylor. All of this sounds really great, but there are some lessons learned that we are still applying as we continue our work today. This may come to no surprise, but funding limitations over the years have made it difficult for our programming to expand and let alone sustain with rising cost of operations, fuel, and living. There has been a disconnectedness developed over the years between nations and the overwhelming amount of work and with initiatives that have come from all of these efforts that these nations have done. And how can a stakeholder truly understand what can't occur when there's 5 websites on MSP in one region? A part of the reason of this disconnectedness exists due to a lack of communication, coordination, and interaction between initiatives and between different levels of nations and provincial staff. This has to improve to avoid duplicating efforts. We've had a lot of successes with community-based led science programs to influence decision-making, but it is now an opportune time to reframe the value and create more of a space for Indigenous knowledge to drive protection programs, as well as a broader decision making and governance. And IPCAs feel like the proper next step. We can dive deeper into specific lessons and how we could have done things better or differently. But we'll leave this with you now, and we're happy to answer any questions once we wrap this up. The one last thing we wanted to share is that this work is still ongoing, and we will continue to do this work long into the future as we pass these responsibilities down to the next generation. We're hoping our successes and lessons can be a platform to support others with the same goals and objectives regarding the deep respect for our Mother Earth. This quote came from the New Hulk Visioning Feast in 2006, and it says, "We are connected to Mother Earth. We are like a spirit, the rocks, and salmon. We must respect this. What we do to the land will happen to us. If we don't respect our resources, no one will." Yeah, thank you everybody for listening today. It's been a pleasure presenting to everybody, and I hope this was very informative for everybody. And thank you, Taylor, and to Julie for, being awesome presenters up here as well.
Thank you very much to Julie, Taylor, and Trinity. A great presentation. So at this point, what we're going to be doing is we have about 10 to 15 minutes to see if there's any questions that anybody has from the audience before we go off into sort of a smaller group. So if you want to, you can raise your hand or you can put a comment into the chat box on the side, and I'll try to field those questions. We have about 34 different participants in here, so also really great to see everybody's interest in the middle of the day and as we're ending February, because we know it's very busy. So I'll just look. I do know I have one question that was asked, and maybe I'll sort of just prompt that out. It was in the questions before we came into the session, and it was whether or not you have any thoughts on how or if any of these particular engagements, I'll call them, because I know there are all sorts of different initiatives, are influencing non-Indigenous conservation practices. So I don't know if anybody had some comments on that.
Julie or Trinity, do either of you want to start?
Well, I know that I'll take a stab, I guess. Like for a lot of these processes, especially with the federal and provincial governments, we've had a number of different interest groups participate, both in terms of as advisory groups, providing feedback on what's been proposed and submitting information for additional consideration and development of the different plans and zones. And one of in terms of like the environmental, like I'm not sure if this question is referring to NGOs, but one of the challenges with many different groups within our territories is trying to achieve either true collaboration in terms of the direction the science is going, questions that are asked, is the types of conservation work that is undertaken. And so I think this process has both kind of highlighted what our goals are with these other groups and kind of trying to steer the direction that a lot of this work goes. Because as I said, like some of the challenges over time have been sometimes the questions that are asked aren't as relevant to the nations or the work that we're trying to achieve. So, and it's also been an opportunity for us to kind of hear some of the key questions and concerns that these other groups have as well, so that we can incorporate them where needed into these processes as well. And it really has helped to kind of getting that feedback has helped to refine some of the key areas within our zones too, and add some additional information than we originally had in the beginning of our nation's marine plans. Hopefully that helped answer the question.
Yeah.
Great.
I'll just,
Taylor?
I could add to that quickly, Heidi. I think another really big piece in that is I think nations realized early on that the science that was being used to inform decision making might have just had, one lens to it. And so they put a lot of effort into the, we saw it in the videos and we saw it in the presentation, but into their guardian programs and monitoring programs. And a lot of that data that the nations collected over the years, now we're finally seeing some of the benefits of that. So, I think they talked about it, but the crab closures, some of these really key decisions that come from DFO have been directly informed from the science and data that nations, guardian teams and other, monitoring and restoration support staff and contractors have really helped drive some of those decisions. And so I know that's kind of, in one way, it's kind of a Western approach to conservation too, but it's been directly informed by a lot of that work that's been done by the nations.
Thanks so much, Julie and Taylor. I think that question came, as I said, from the beginning, when we have the questions that you can ask as you're registering. So we always recommend anybody wants to get something that will probably address those first. So appreciate it. Nicole Glaze has another question, and so it's in the chat, but could you explain the NMPCA tool and how it was used in establishment of the IMCA?
So I'm guessing, I'll just clarify, Nicole, are you wondering if the National Marine Conservation Area tool, Parks Canada, how it was used with the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas?
Yeah, you had talked about some sort of overlap, and I just wanted to know how that was helpful or challenging, or I didn't quite understand the details of it.
No, it's a lot. It's confusing, and so apologies if that wasn't made clear. I can follow up just with talking about that collaborative National Marine Conservation Area that the nations are working with Parks Canada right now to establish. In a parallel process, nations are working internally to look at their own territories and where they would like to establish IPCAs in the marine space. One thing that they're looking at, so it's not completely decided, is just where they want to put those IPCAs in consideration of where these collaborative zoning for a conservation area reserve with Parks Canada would be. And so kind of a creative way to look at this is that nations are considering completely overlapping the proposed boundary of the NMCAR with an IPCA. So each time, each area that is covered by the NMCA tool with Parks Canada that is in the nation's marine territory, they want a complete overlap with an Indigenous protected and conserved area. And so that allows, for multiple things. So if, say, something happens with this collaborative process with Parks Canada, something falls through, the nations still have a declaration there that says that this is what their interests and objectives are in terms of protection in their territory. So that's kind of just kind of a safeguard around demonstrating to stakeholders and government that this is what they want for their territories. And another piece of that is that when they declare those IPCAs, then they're looking towards management planning. And so we talked a bit about kind of the history of marine planning, but nations really they developed their own marine plans before even entering into collaborative planning processes with government. So this is kind of has a potential and an opportunity to mirror that process where they can develop, once their IPCAs are declared, they can start management planning immediately internally. And so by the time that the NMCA is established, if it goes through, and they look in towards management planning, the nations are already one step ahead. So, the nations can come to the table to be like, yes, this is the kind of management planning or management plan that we envision for our territory. And it makes it kind of puts government on the spot in a way where they have to be responsive, but it's kind of allowing nations to really drive that collaborative process when that does happen. Is that clear? I know it's a lot of acronyms and Julie and Trinity, if I missed anything, please come in, but hopefully that explains it a bit better.
It does a lot. If we had more time, I'd ask you more details about the tool, but I know we only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to do some of my own research. Thank you so much for answering the question.
Well, again, our contact information is there, Nicole, and we can follow up with it. But if you ever want to talk more about it, we can connect you with our NMCA project manager, just to be able to cover any of those questions that you have, because it's complicated stuff. It's good.
It also creates an opportunity maybe for a future webinar that talks a little bit more about in depth of some of those topics. So thanks so much, Nicole, for that question, and Taylor for answering. We do have one more that I just want to put in there for the last 3 or 4 minutes. And this was from the registration questions. There's 3 or 4 people asking about the same thing. So I'm just going to kind of summarize it a bit, but it's, whether or not there's any governance plans for community well-being and sort of how the process and the objectives are kind of leading towards community well-being, and then how do you define the scope of well-being? So it's sort of an all-encompassing well-being focus. And maybe if I can help a little bit on that one, given my research in this area, just to help with the way the question is phrased. You spoke a little bit about, the economies, the health. So it's really about how the community, how you scope out what you mean by community well-being, and maybe how that's been influenced by this process.
So from my perspective, when I'm so new to this field. I just started, and when I think of community well-being, I think of like us as people like helping each other and being healthy and seeing these stocks come back into our valleys and into our watersheds, so that we can have those cultural practices back into our lives. Um, I wish that I had the opportunity to see, those Oligan stocks in our Bella Coola River here. And to practice those traditional uses that we had. When I envision community well-being, I see salmon stocks in our rivers. I see our young people becoming more involved in traditional and cultural practices again. And and just seeing our communities fed healthily. um yeah from my perspective, that's what I see. A lot of community well-being is just having those practices back into our lives again, and really affecting our health and well-being.
Thank you, Trinity. And I don't know if Julie, if you had any additional thoughts on that before we close it out, or Taylor.
No, I think she covered it fairly well. But yeah, like community well-being is kind of nebulous sometimes, but it's essentially like some of the core values that are within all Four Nations plans are around food security, around maintaining cultural knowledge transfer and practices, and access to all different types of foods, not just salmon, not just limited fisheries that we tend to we have left right now, as well, like rebuilding in a coastal economy, because as was mentioned in the videos and early in the presentation, like a big part of who we are as coastal peoples is be able to gather food and make a living off of the territory that we depend on, and also just having the ability to have a say in how everything is managed, and not just having to listen to a top-down approach where when we went as living people from the land, we can see what's going on and what needs to be done, and we're finally getting to a place in time where we might actually have a say in how things are managed, not just being told how things are going to be managed, which is also very strengthening both for all of our nations.
Thank you to both of you, and that's a great way to sort of segue. So I think I'm going to bring Beck back up to the screen for a moment, and I can't remember if we do draw prizes now or if it's later, but we are going to be moving into a Indigenous only section where we can ask questions to the speakers. So we'll just wait for Beck to give me the go ahead, and we'll start that process.
Absolutely. Thanks, Heidi. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, Trinity, Julie, Taylor. Just stay on the line and we'll get into our Indigenous only session. For those of you that are heading out and not staying on, I just dropped the link to our YouTube channel in the chat so that you can come back to this webinar and others in the series again, and so that our presenters can find their webinar as well if you guys want to see what you look like on camera. We don't have a date for a next webinar this fiscal coming up, but there will be one more, so it'll be a surprise for all of us. Please stay tuned for that. Wherever you saw the advertisement for this one, there'll be one other. And I think that is all the news, Heidi. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. For all of our Mi'kmaq, Indigenous First Nations participants, please feel free to stay on the line, and hopefully we can have another 30 minutes of really detailed conversation.